In this video, I want to speak about something that's massively important to the business of animation that we'll be doing, but which I don't really want to spend much time talking about, somewhat paradoxically. And that thing is rigs. Obviously, we've got all sorts of tools in Lightwave for working with our animation, from, key graph editors and whatnot, which of course we will see in due course in this series. But by far the most important animation tool that you will have at any point in time is the rig with which you are animating. Now, of course, this series is an animation tutorial. What I do not want to do is to teach animation on one specific rig. The reason why? Well, because there is no such thing as one universal rig that is used for every character in every situation. The rigs that you have for any given character and any given project might be wide and varied. You might have made them in Rigit, you might have made them with Genoma, they might be rigs that you have built yourself, they might be rigs that someone else has built and supplied you with. Consequently, there is no one fixed rig and no one fixed way of operating it or animating it. So when it comes to taking a character rig which you have got and, figuring out what does what and how it poses and moves and which controller operates which bit, you will, to some extent, be on your own. However, supplied with these tutorials here, you will have quite a few different rigs that you can choose to play with, which are set up in different ways and from, different setups, some of which are Rigit rigs, all very nice and well featured, lots of cool controls and easy to get along with. That's all very nice. Others are Genoma rigs, very similar sort of thing, but different sets of controls and different ways of working in certain areas and different availability of controls. And for various other examples, we have, specifically custom-made rigs which are designed specifically for the purpose that they're intended to animate this particular type of thing. They're not Rigit, they're not Genoma, they're very much individual custom rigs like the car one, or the little lamp guy with his own very simple custom rig, as we see working here. So a good variety of different things for you to play with in that regard. Of course, it does help a great deal when trying to, figure out what to do with a given rig, to have some basic understanding of the ways in which rigs are laid out, the ways they are designed, what is, FK, what is IK, stuff like that, especially if you're newer to this sort of thing. So if you've not already seen them, do be sure to pop over to my YouTube channel and have a look at the RH rigging tutorials section, which has the foundations set of videos from my rigging series. That will inform you on quite a few important bits and pieces about how rigs work and the types of systems that are commonly built into them. Also, in the case of the supplied Rigit rigs, if you have a look at the Rigit 2 playlist section, then you'll find in here various videos that describe the operation of certain parts, how they're intended to work, how certain controllers should be manipulated. And there's also a couple of videos that give you animation walkthrough examples using entire Rigit rigs in here. One thing that's very important to be aware of on different rigs is that you will get different controls and different styles of systems of controls available to you, simply owing to the fact that different rigs will be built in different ways and different riggers will have different approaches to how they set things up. For instance, you can take this guy here as an example. You can see that an awful lot of his controllers here are null items. And so that's grand if you're wanting to manipulate several things at a time. You can grab several and operate them all at once like this. However, here for his arms, he uses bones as his controls. And so to pose the arms, you have to grab and manipulate these bones here. What Lightwave doesn't allow you to do is to select both bones and nulls at the same time. You're either in object selection mode or bone selection mode or light or camera, etc. You can't have multi-selections that include mixed types like that. We can also, as I say, see differences in systems of controls. Common example is a foot rig like we have here. What you can see is that we have this main foot control object which operates the IK for the leg here, taking the whole foot with it, and we also have these extra controllers that work within the foot space, such as here we have a little toe flap controller that lets us get individual flap on the toe. We have a ball lift controller, which operating that gives us pivoting up from the ball here. We have a tiptoe, which lets you, manipulate the foot and pivot it around on its toe position. And also there, we just saw briefly, a heel control that lets you pivot around from the heel position. Now this is fine, but these are of course separate controllers, so if we're wanting to, change a pose timing for the entire foot, we've got it posed up somehow, we have to make sure that we're selecting all of these controls. Perhaps if we've got a hold, we've got to make sure that, keyframes are kept on all of them and so forth. If we see this foot rig here, then in many ways it's kind of similar. You've got this main, foot object there that allows you to pose the entire leg on IK. However, you've also got this one reverse foot controller, and this allows you to perform most of these foot actions here just off of the one control there. Rather than having multiple controls, you have one control using multiple channels. As such, it's no different in the number of keyframes that you need to be able to manipulate, but it does mean that you've just got fewer items that you need to be able to manage. You can also see that because of this, it leaves you with other ancillary items free to perform additional actions. So if you are pivoted up on the toe like this using the front to back flip control, then you can still get additional rotation off the toe point here like this, or indeed sweep the toe position around in this manner. And we also see that the IK goal itself, the actual IK goal, is exposed, which enables you to mush the foot around within this rig space like that, which of course gives you an added layer of control for creating subtle little shifts and nuances of motion within your foot motion. Something else that you might discover between different rigs is of course that either, a certain type of control is present or missing, or that you need to work controls slightly differently in order to achieve a given pose. For instance, let's say that you've got again the foot rig here and you're wanting to be able to, tip the foot and lean it on its side, on its edge. In this foot rig, we see that, we can tip the foot a number of ways. We can tip, the main root item here, or we can tip this ball controller, or of course we can tip the tiptoe controller here. All of these do that same thing. However, of course, they're all rotating it centrally. There's no kind of edge tip involved. Thus, if we want to get the foot to pivot up on its edge, we have to both tip the control like this, but we also have to change its position like that to actually make the edge come into correct contact, which of course means that when you're transitioning to this pose from the flat pose, you need to make sure that the crossover between the two poses and that the in-betweens are all sorted out so as you don't, have the foot dipping below the floor or something during the transition. On this rig here, you can work in exactly the same way. You can tip the foot to the side like this and then just go and reposition it to get it up onto its edge like that. However, it does have a special tip control already built in, which you can see here. It tips side to side and you get proper edge contact on each side of the foot like that. Far quicker and easier and more accessible, and obviously less tweening work to have to worry about. The point is again to emphasize what I've already said. Every rig may well be different. The rigs that you build yourself or get from others may have a variety of different structures available. And so one of the things that you should always do to assess a given rig before animating with it is to have a good detailed look at the controls and see how you achieve various poses with them. And of course think about any kind of transitions that would be needed to get you from one pose to another, and how you can work the controllers together in a way that makes that happen more easily or seamlessly, or ideally that might require less work whilst you're actually in the process of animating itself. Something else quite important to be aware of is that you do have sort of two different ways of creating rigs in Lightwave. You have this classical method, which are the rigs that we've seen here so far, these are what we would call constraint-based rigs. That is, they're all set up with various motion controllers, IK, different kinds of constraint, and so on to give their mechanisms and their functionality, make it all work when you grab a controller and twist it, move it, what have you. The other rigging method that we have available is this, IK Booster. Which is, really nice and simple. You can just take a hierarchy of stuff, nulls, bones, what have you, just apply IK Booster and straight away you get this, control, rig, stuff going on. It's great. However, even though you have this control, what you don't actually really have is a control rig. This isn't really an IK setup that's been put on this leg here. Rather, you're able to manipulate the hierarchy in an IK fashion. It's IK manipulation for FK chains. If you're not sure about the difference, make sure that you've watched the IK FK video there in the RH Rigging Foundation section on the YouTube. The point of this is that whilst you can indeed, key things out in IK like this, simple little walk there, and it all looks good on those keyframes, there's no actual IK goals receiving those keyframes. It's just a set of FK keys on the bones themselves. The result of that is that you wind up with these drifting positions where things are, of course, meant to be locked off and solid. Now that can be a problem because when you're, performing an animation, when you're, in the midst of doing it, you want to be able to watch it back and see it all going on. Having stuff like this happen is very distracting. It sort of distracts your eye. You say to yourself, is this walk good? Is it bad? Do I need to adjust this frame, that frame? Do I need to retime, whatever? This effect sort of, ruins your eye to a certain extent. It makes it hard to get a good view of what's happening. Now it's fixable. You can set up bake spots for these points, and so when you set a bake spot, that, refixes, it does all of the in-between FK animation to keep the point that you've told to stay fixed, baked and held in place like this. So that's fine, you can perfectly well fix your IKB animation in this way, so as you do have locked off IK style behaviour on parts. The problem that you've then got, of course, is the fact that you've got baked keyframes on all of these bones. If now that I've done this and I think to myself, I really want to speed the walk up, I want to slow it down, I want to retime it somehow, this is a huge pain. It also means, of course, that I can't just do simple graph editing on this, IK goal, as it were, to try and, manage its arc of motion as it, swings or passes or whatever it does. The short story of this is that you wind up having to do an awful lot more work on keyframe management. IK Boost does have its own, keyframe management tools built in. But one of the things that you will do an awful lot when animating is you will tend to just rough motions out and then sort of refine them, especially timing and spacing of things. And when doing that, you really want to try and create as few keyframes as possible, at least to start with. You want to sort of add more and more keyframes as you're working toward more detail. As such, being stuck having to use baked keys like this is extremely inhibiting, at least when it comes to doing hand-keyed, straight-up performance character animation. IK Boost has got a lot of nice features in it. It can do a lot of things. If you're trying to quickly knock out a whole bunch of walk cycles on some background characters, or trying to just grab motions that you've done on one thing and just reuse them on background characters, it works pretty well. It's a very fast way of doing that. It's also pretty good if you want to be able to edit motion capture. Of course, motion capture comes in just on, a plain set of bones like this. If you want to create adjustments to those, either on that skeleton itself or on that skeleton before you retarget the motion to some other character or rig, IK Boost also allows you a very fast, flexible way for creating that kind of motion editing. Another problem that you get with baked animation, and this is true, for stuff that you've done like that with IKB, but also, of course, for motion capture, worth mentioning quickly, is that once you are baked down to one key per frame, you're sort of locked into your frame rate. Remember, of course, in the introduction when I was saying that we would be using 24 frames per second throughout the examples in this tutorial? Well, of course, sometimes you do need to output at a different frame per second rate. You might need to go out at 25 for PAL, you might need to go out at 30 frames per second for NTSC. And one of the things that you will quickly discover once you get used to animating at one frame rate is that it can be a bit challenging to suddenly have to animate at a different one. You get used to animating at 24 frames per second, you get used to the fact that, maybe a step is 10 frames, 12 frames, what have you. Suddenly you have to work at 30 frames per second, and all of the experience and instinct that you've worked up for timing suddenly works against you. You wind up animating a bit too slow, a bit too fast. As such, it can be helpful to be able to animate at one frame rate and to output at another. However, with baked animation, and we can see this guy here, this is a motion capture clip, pay attention to his feet and their contact here. He is currently at 24 frames per second here, and we can see that his feet are nice and steady there on the ground. That's grand. Let's bring up the options and let's shift this to 30 frames per second now. So maybe we've animated this at 24 and want to output at 30. Watch what we now see when he's walking. You see there's this little jiggle, there's this shimmer, or whatever you want to call it, taking place on the feet. They sort of buzz ever so slightly whilst in contact. The reason is because, of course, this is, fully FK here. There's nothing making the ankles or the feet reach for the ground position. And so because we've shifted our frame rate, we're now getting keys at fractional positions, and that means that we're seeing in between positions, that is interpolated positions between actual recorded keyframes, and since it's all in FK, that doesn't keep the foot perfectly rock steady on the ground. However, when you've got a constraint-based rig like this fellow here, well, first of all, you can see the different keyframes that we've got in place there for the main foot IK goals. If we decide actually I want him to lift that foot off the ground a little bit sooner, it's easy. I just grab the one keyframe and I drag it, and bingo, there it is. I can retime my animation really quickly and easily like that. It's so immediate to be able to work that way. And we've got, of course, locked off contact the whole time. But because these are also locked individual keys, I can shift my frame rate around. This is all animated at 24 frames per second. I can put it to something stupid like 63.29 frames per second if I want. And what we see is that despite this frame rate discrepancy between that which I animated and that which I've shifted to, everything stays put. Everything remains nice and clean and as it should be. And so we're able to take our animation and change the frame rate for final output very easily. Depending on exactly what you've got going on, maybe you've got some weird switch constraint, an IKFK switch, or somebody picking something up, putting something down via a constraint. You might occasionally see the odd little blip occur as a fractional keyframe gets picked. But of course, that's just, one or two keyframes that you have to go and fix, just as sort of a final polish before you output. Again, very simple, very easy to diagnose. Of course, as I say, the purpose of these tutorials really is to teach animation itself rather than the operation, the actual, structural operation of any one rig or style of rig. However, one of the other things that you will find is true about constraint-based rigs is that they are the industry standard for such. Take the free rigs available on the like of the 11 Second Club, take the rigs that are supplied through somewhere like animationrigs.com, take the rigs that are given away here on Animation Mentor or used by Animation Mentor, take the rigs and the rigging courses that are done by iAnimate here, all the same thing. They all have these constraint-based rigs where certain control systems can be designed and controlled most easily by the animator to allow for the business of animation, setting your timing, your spacing, managing your keyframes, and all of that. It's for this reason that we will be using exclusively constraint-based rigs throughout these tutorials, even though we will have a mix of different ones, as I've already mentioned. At the end of the day, you should go ahead and, move on, perform your animation using whichever kind of rig, rigging style, manual rigging, auto rigging, whatever it is that you like. However, for starting out, getting to grips with things, The rigs that are supplied with this content will stand you in the best stead for moving forward. They will enable you to learn the principles and practice of animation somewhat more quickly, and of course they will also allow you an easier time if you transition out of Lightwave to animating in some other package. Lastly, one of the most important things to focus on when it does come down to frame rate and so on is you need to have, as much as you can, a nice efficient rig, one that can play back real time. Here I am, I'm at 63 some odd frames a second, and we see that my character, I just hit play here in the timeline, no preview. It's playing smoothly and cleanly enough I can watch the action taking place. This is particularly handy to be able to do when you are working with your animation, editing it. You can do stuff like open up the graph editor and say, well, maybe I need to adjust these points, maybe it needs to sort of bob down more, so I can make my graph editor adjustments there whilst the whole thing is playing back, and I can see my adjustments occurring in real time. This is a huge boon when it comes to retiming, respacing your animation, working on getting things just at the right point, the right height, the right rate of motion and stuff like that. To be perfectly honest, I don't believe I am getting a full 63 frames per second playback at the minute on this character. I believe it's probably somewhere, close, probably about, 30, 40 frames per second, largely because I'm screen recording here, so that's slowing me down. But the important point to note is that you keep play at exact rate on, and that way 1 second of animation will always play back in 1 second, no matter how many frames per second Lightwave is capable of spitting out and actually, rendering in your viewport. For the majority of rigs, the majority of the time with the majority of characters, you should find that that does give you smooth enough playback to just be able to operate the standard timeline playback here. And so going in to create a preview, to create a full frame rate playback by which you can judge how your animation is doing, is a much rarer thing that you will need to do. When it does come to real-time speeds of playback with constraint-driven rigs, as I say, most rigs, 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, they should play back fine in real time on the majority of systems. As you get, 2, 3, 4 characters in a scene, that'll start to slow down somewhat. But also very important is the geometry. When you've got geometry being deformed by Lightwave, the frame rate will suffer. For this reason, doing stuff like keeping your sub-patch level for a character down at 0 will give you improved performance. That's going almost twice as fast with sub-patch set to 0 there for me now. If I go up to something like sub-patch 4, whilst I get a lovely smooth character, I get very choppy animation. So keeping your character mesh at a low resolution whilst animating will also be exceedingly helpful. And if you've got still too much slowdown to get, nice, smooth, real-time playback speed, it's always worth just using a proxy object that you can stick on there, just simple, boxes or cylinders, which may or may not be deformed by the bones. Maybe you'll just parent it to the different parts of the rig, whatever it takes really to get as fast a playback interactive speed. The other important point to having fast feedback rigs, though, much beyond being able to just hit play and get you out of the inconvenience of having to create constant previews every time you want to watch your animation back, is the ability to be able to scrub whilst you're animating. Just grab your timeline and run over a little piece of emotion that you're working on and just, scrub back and forth over it like this to see how it's working. Of course, in traditional animation that's, hand-drawn, the animator would have, their frames on different sheets of paper laid on top of one another like this, and they would just be able to hold them between their fingers and just flip through them so that whilst they were animating, whilst they were drafting out each frame, they could perform just a little flip back and forth to see how the motion was evolving, which is pretty much the same as looking at an animation flip book. like this. Certainly, whilst animating, having the ability to do this in the computer is also exceedingly important, and you'll find that when you are working on motions, checking things like your timings, seeing how something flows, how smooth it is, and so on, you'll find yourself just wanting to scrub your time, just flip through small sections of animation far more often than you will actually want to play back the whole thing. If you have a very slow rig and this is like clunk, 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 when you're trying to do that, then it's very difficult to get a sense of the motion that is occurring, and it makes working on it a much more painful process. You should find that all of the rigs that are supplied with this training, the Rigit ones, Genoma ones, the custom ones, should all play back real time on the vast majority of systems. You would probably have to have a very slow computer for them not to give you a decent playback rate, animating at 24 frames per second. So there we have it. There's a quick run through for you of the basic need-to-knows of the rigs that we're going to be using, the rigs that you should be using, the different issues that will affect how easy or difficult it is to get on with your animation, and some of the specific things that your rig really need to provide you with to give you the optimal animation environment.